Take a look at this image. Bombs and aid simultaneously dropped on Palestinians from the skies above the Gaza Strip. The perfect encapsulation of an outrageously insane and immoral U.S. policy. On the one hand, we ship 2,000-pound bunker buster bombs to help our ally with their genocide. On the other, we drop a pathetic amount of food so that our murderous president can pretend he cares about these lives. There's an election coming up after all. An artist captured this dynamic well too, portraying an onslaught of bombs raining down on a destroyed Gaza. Interspersed among those bombs, a couple loaves of bread. Unfortunately, even this aid has proved deadly for Palestinians. 5 people, including this beautiful child, were killed by one of these aid drops when the parachute malfunctioned, bringing to awful reality the warnings of experts that these drops are dangerous and are no substitute for a lasting ceasefire and forcing Israel to allow in the hundreds of aid trucks that are amassed at the Gaza border. But it is not only our bombs and bullets that have helped to push this population to absolute desperation. We have backed Israel at every turn. When they throw on a new set of lies and propaganda, whether it's beheaded babies or a Hamas command center underneath of a hospital, or the evidence-free allegation that UN aid workers are actually Hamas terrorists. You remember that, right? On the very day that the International Court of Justice ruled Israel was plausibly committing genocide, we parroted, here in the United States, Israel's evidence-free claims that some dozen UNRWA employees were involved in October 7th, and then we used that as a pretext to strip funding from that critical organization, which just so happens to be the top aid organization on the ground in Gaza. So our response to the ICJ ruling was to heighten the genocidal conditions, exacerbate the starvation by cutting aid. Of course, even if true, these claims about a dozen employees would not justify an attack on the entire organization. But it almost immediately emerged that no evidence was actually offered by the Israeli government to back up these extraordinary claims. The UN says they still have not been given any evidence. And now we are learning something even more shocking. According to the UN, the IDF tortured UNRWA aid workers in order to extract false confessions of Hamas affiliation. Really sit with this, because I can scarcely believe the depths of depravity that this revelation reflects. The Israelis tortured UN staffers, humanitarian aid workers. They then used these fake confessions to push the world to defund UNRWA, also that they could more effectively starve the civilian population. And we, here in the United States, our president went right along with it. Here is a bit of that report. The UN Agency for Palestinian Refugees said some employees released into Gaza from Israeli detention reported having been pressured by Israeli authorities into falsely stating that the agency has Hamas links and that staff took part in the October 7th attacks. The assertions are contained in a report by the UN Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA, reviewed by Reuters and dated February 2024, which detailed allegations of mistreatment in Israeli detention made by unidentified Palestinians, including several working for UNRWA. The document said several UNRWA Palestinian staffers had been detained by the Israeli army and added that the ill treatment and abuse they said they had experienced included severe physical beatings, waterboarding, and threats of harm to family members. Severe physical beatings, waterboarding, and threats to family members. I guess we shouldn't be surprised, since Israel has already killed more UN workers than anyone else in history. And Israel has so little shame about these war crimes that they proudly broadcast them to the entire world, and especially to their own revenge-drunk nation. Here's a report that was broadcast on Israeli TV showing how they humiliate prisoners and demand that they admit that they are actually Hamas, even when they swear that they are not. That, as of now, unreleased UN report that we were just discussing, that says a lot more, too, about the routine torture meted out against anyone fortunate enough to be detained, not just those UN aid workers. Former prisoners testified that they were beaten, they were deprived of sleep, they were held without adequate food and water, not allowed access to bathrooms, and some were sexually abused. The injuries sustained during their captivity were severe enough and the medical neglect so profound that every prisoner release necessitated ambulances to transport former captives for emergency medical care. And those are the lucky ones. According to Israeli outlet Haaretz, at least 27 Palestinians have died in Israeli custody since October 7th. The Israeli government refuses to divulge the details surrounding those deaths. In the wake of these revelations about forced UNRWA confessions and as reports pour out of the Strip of babies starving to death, children with bodies wasted from malnutrition, countries with slightly more shame than the U.S. have actually reversed course. Of the dozen countries which had suspended funding to UNRWA under U.S. and Israeli pressure, Sweden, Canada, and the EU have now all restored their aid dollars to this aid group, whose mission has literally never been more critical or more impossible to fulfill. But not the U.S. We are standing strong with our big bombs and tiny bread strategy, shipping the weapons of death, defunding the most critical aid agency, and acting faux shocked at the predictable results that we ourselves engineered. And what are those results? Well, let me show you another image which perfectly encapsulates U.S. policy. This precious angel, only 10 years old, Gazan died from malnutrition shortly after this video was taken. Gazan had cerebral palsy and was reliant on a diet of soft foods with high nutrition. He couldn't walk, but he loved to swim. His father, who you see in this video, lovingly tended to Gazan's care, therapy, and feeding every day until the siege on Gaza and constant bombing made that life-giving care impossible. But Gazan is not alone. 15% of northern Gaza children are acutely malnourished. In the south, the number is roughly 5%. Dozens of children, mostly babies, have died already of starvation. Infants are the most at risk as their mothers are too weak to produce milk. Formula is rare, clean water non-existent. But don't worry, starving babies of Gaza. Our great president, after defunding the main aid agency based on torture forced confessions and helping bomb the hell out of a trapped population, he's building a temporary port in a few months to facilitate a slightly larger but still wildly inadequate amount of aid. An absurd boondoggle so that Biden and the Dems can pretend they aren't just cold-hearted killers. But they are. They killed Gazan just as surely as if they had put a gun to his head, supplying the bombs that upended his world, ignoring the desperate warnings that famine was imminent, defunding the most important aid organization, and running cover for Israel's lies at every chance they could. When the history is written of the Gaza genocide, many of the details are going to be forgotten. Will we remember this stupid frickin' port? Are we going to remember how Kamala called for a temporary ceasefire and the media pretended like it was an actual policy shift? Or how Biden sort of told MSNBC that he had red lines before immediately proclaiming that he will never leave Israel? Probably not. A lot of those details will be lost. But the images of Gazan, body impossibly wasted, skin stretched over his tiny skeleton, an image that unavoidably recalls the torturous horrors of the Holocaust. These images and our complicity in causing them, we could never forget if we spent our whole lives trying. Part of the picture of the starvation of Palestinians in Gaza, which has reached horrific levels, and I'm talking a little bit more about this in my monologue as well, but part of that picture, which we have been covering, is these protests, which have been allowed to persist by the IDF and the Israeli government and the Israeli police force, have allowed these protesters to block aid coming into the Gaza Strip. CNN's Clarissa Ward, to her credit, went and talked to these protesters and argued with them a bit about what they're doing. Let's take a listen to how that went.
Under international law, it's Israel's obligation to make sure that the ordinary citizens of Gaza don't starve to death. And right now they are starving to death.
Hamas is making it very difficult because Hamas is not allowing this to arrive. They're not holding it. They're not receiving it. But they will do it. I'm telling you here and now. If we knew it's getting to children of Gaza, we would do it. This does not arrive at their doorstep. This arrives into the tunnels of Hamas that are fighting us and holding our hostages.
There's no evidence to support the idea that all of this aid is going to Hamas.
Not to the rest of the population. This is intelligence only for terror. That's why they should get only the minimum calories required to survive.
They're starving to death.
They are not.
They are starving to death.
You know what? If they are starving to death, give the hostages back. No, a single loaf of bread should go there till our hostages are coming back.
To many people in the world, listening to what you're saying and what you're protesting for, it sounds like A, a contravention of international law, and B, incredibly callous.
You know, even if there is a humanitarian crisis, and there is not, even if there is, it's my right and my duty to prioritize the life of few bibas, 1-year-old babies that deserve over any Gazan baby.
Just wild, the justifications here. I mean, first, the denial of reality, right? Well, they're not starving. They literally are. I mean, we've had now dozens of, especially infants, starving to death. And this is happening now on a daily basis. Infants particularly at risk because mothers are so weak, they're unable to breastfeed. Formula and milk is not widely available, difficult to come by. When you do come by it, there is effectively no clean water available. So these babies are being dispatched from the hospital. They're immediately getting sick, having diarrhea, and just literally wasting away. So that's where we are. So that's the first thing. Oh, well, they're not really starving. There isn't really a humanitarian crisis. Also, Hamas is just stealing the aid. There's not evidence of that either. I mean, there may be some one-off instances, but we have not seen, widespread indications that Hamas is stealing the aid. Anyway, basically the bottom line is, even if there is a humanitarian crisis, I don't really care because it's my duty to prioritize me and mine first. And again, Sagar, let's be honest, this is the view not only of the Israeli government, which we've seen implemented in terms of policy. Their official government policy is to basically collective punishment, hold the entire population of Gaza hostage for their own ends. And additionally, enjoys a lot of support from the Israeli domestic population, which is why these protests have been allowed to go on.
Well, yeah, it comes at a certain point. It's like, look, there are crazy people in any country, and it's about how the government deals with said crazy people. And it's like, well, whenever you're going to spray people in Tel Aviv who are members of hostage families because they're protesting, and you're going to break them up with police force, but these people get to stay there with impunity, then this is a government-sanctioned protest. That's why it's worth highlighting. It's not like, yeah, I'm not denying that, this element and all that wouldn't exist in Israeli society at a private level, but it's more about the allowing it to continue and not even allowing, in many cases being cheered on by members of the cabinet. Then this is a government policy. This is something that you are sanctioning and you support. That's what connects back to the debates are in the U.S. and specifically why it is so crazy that we're building this pier and this military operation when these people are the only ones standing in their way, and the Israelis have proven to us that they have no issues, using force against their own citizens whenever it comes to civil protests and all that they don't like. So then do the same thing here, but they won't do it, and that's why the whole situation is nuts. Yeah, and to bring it back to U.S. policy, as Biden is now pretending because he realized he has a political problem, that he cares about the suffering and the plight of Palestinian civilians. We just learned, put this up on the screen, that there have been more than 100 arms sales to Israel post-October 7th. And this Guardian article details how they use these legal loopholes to avoid public scrutiny and to avoid congressional oversight. Let me just read you a little bit. They say the U.S. is reported to have made more than 100 weapon sales to Israel, including thousands of bombs, since the start of the war in Gaza. But the deliveries escaped congressional oversight because each transaction was under the dollar amount requiring approval. The Arms Export Control Act makes significant exceptions for arms sales to close allies, a limit of $25 million for major defense equipment, and the limit rises to $100 million for, quote, other defense articles like bombs. They have a number of quotes here from people who are concerned about this policy. One person who's the director of the Security Assistance Monitor at the Center for International Policy think tank said, this doesn't just seem like an attempt to avoid technical compliance with U.S. arms export law. It's an extremely troubling way to avoid transparency and accountability on a high-profile issue. So how are you going to claim, and even MSNBC is calling this out at this point, how are you going to claim that you care about Palestinian civilians when you are skirting congressional authority to ship as many weapons as possible, as quickly as possible, to, destroy all of Palestinian civilian institutions, to, kill tens of thousands of Palestinian civilians, something that even the Biden administration admits at this point, which really raises a question for me of what the actual death toll really must be. How can you claim that this little piddly bit of aid is anything but a PR stunt when this is the actual reality of your policy?